Well, you guys, I'm so super excited to have a dear friend on with us today, someone whose art I've admired for years and years. And a really quick story. In 1991, the college band directors had their national convention in Kansas City at the University of Missouri Kansas City Conservatory, and Indiana University played. It was a great concert. There's one of our oboists actually did her undergrad there. And if I'm not mistaken, they started with circuits. I think it's the first thing they played on that concert. And I remember sitting there and it was like I'd been struck by lightning. I just sat there and I thought, who in the heck is that? And where does that compositional voice come from? Oh my gosh. And I just couldn't wait to finally meet her. And over the years, we've done some things together, and I've been in on some commissions and got to premiere a piece or two of hers. She's an incredible person that we've had opportunity to get to know. So Cindy, what we do here in this little thing that we're doing, we're engaged in an online kind of corporate composition thing where they're working with recording themselves and then going into the readily available things like GarageBand and Audacity and this and that. And they're divided up into teams and they're making compositions. So that's a part of it. The other part of it is having people speak into their lives about their own processes when it comes to making music and making art. But also, and importantly, I think during this time, one of the things that we've really enjoyed is hearing about the life journey of these various artists, because students, and Cindy, if you didn't know, is a longtime composition professor of 3 decades, 27 years, I think, at North Texas, something like that.
That's correct.
And so you know, students, oftentimes students will look at people who have jobs, whether they're playing or teaching, and they just think, oh, that was easy. You know, they just went to school and just kind of walked into their job. But everyone's life is not like that. It's a zigzag. And I know yours was. And especially, of course, the local ties. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Sure.
Because without the group that I'm talking to right now, you don't exist.
It's true.
So if you could go ahead and start from the beginning, that would be awesome. And I'll help you if you feel the need.
First of all, I would like to say how honored I am to have this opportunity to talk with you and your band. I wish you all well. I can't see all of you, I guess. It's like this audience in the ether, but you know, there's a special place in my heart for my friends and family from Washington State, and I've been especially worried, of course, during this time, but it looks like you've weathered this storm better than some. I mean, your leadership seems to have been pretty good there and brought you through a lot of hard times. I'm so thankful for that. My history goes back a lot of years, and it started in the little town of Eatonville, Washington. I wasn't actually born there. I was born in Tacoma, not far away. But this was a town of about 800 people in those days. And my parents were both musicians. My mother, in fact, both of my parents were members of the University of Washington. Did they call it wind ensemble in those days? I don't know, the band.
I think he called it the Wind Sinfonietta.
This was under the direction of Maestro Welke, right?
Yes, exactly. On the job from 1929 to 1974.
Wow. Who I actually did meet, you know, when I was in high school. I remember he came to do a band concert with what they call an honor band concert at Eatonville High School. I remember my mother sort of organized that, having been in his band. She played. I'm very proud of my mother. She played. She's gone now, but so I guess I have to talk about her in the past. But she played first clarinet in his band. My dad played trumpet. And that went on for a couple of years until she got pregnant with me, and that was the end of that story. But I guess I can't complain. I'm sad she didn't get to complete her education there, but she did go back to school in after I was maybe 10 years old, and got an education degree from Pacific Lutheran University, which is in Tacoma, a school where I attended as well. So growing up in Eatonville, we had a piano in the house, and we had other instruments, but there weren't any classically trained musicians in town that anybody knew about. So my parents decided I might have some lessons with a woman in town who could read music. She didn't read a lot of music. She was mostly a dance hall musician. And so my early memories of playing the piano were, here's a piece of sheet music with a melody, and she taught me a little bit about what the chord symbols meant. She said, I want you to come back each time for a lesson playing the piece differently.
Wow.
So a totally different kind of way of learning music, you know. If you're going to play Bach, I suppose you're supposed to play what Bach put on the page, right? And so this was not what Bach wrote, but what Cindy has invented. And that absolutely was formative. I mean, it was the beginning of my path toward composition. So in high school, I was the pianist for the choir. And I remember they were singing Brahms, and I continued to improvise. Brahms, you know, I had absolutely no reverence for the masters. I was a terrible student of classical music as a youngster. But I had this other experience, and that led me to jazz, of course, the idea of improvisation. And when I went to college, I was involved in the jazz bands and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the way it worked for me. I did get the discipline of classical study eventually, but it really wasn't until maybe a junior in high school when I could drive myself to Parkland, where I studied with a man who had taught at PLU for a while. I was maybe 16, 17 when I started to study classical music seriously. So I came to that a little bit on the late side, but didn't take me long to immerse myself in it and understand the depth and beauty of it. But always the impetus to improvise was there, and that's I'm sure that's what took me to composition. One of the main reasons I went into composition, because I had that confidence that my teacher had instilled in me at such an early age, that you can do what you want. You know, she gave me permission to explore and to invent. I think I've talked to a lot of music educators about that idea of doing both, of really getting to know the master works of our culture and those of other cultures, if you can, but also getting to know a lot about the popular culture, which does encourage some freedom that the classical culture does not. So it's makes for a nice combination, I think. So I was at PLU for 3 years as an undergraduate when along came into my life composer Krzysztof Penderecki. He just passed a couple of months ago, sadly, in Poland in his 80s. Don't know exactly how old he was, but we were doing a festival of his music at PLU. And there were some performances of the larger pieces, the St. Luke Passion for orchestra and chorus and soloists. So I played saxophone in that piece. And then there was a concert of chamber music. I played piano. And then there was a concert of his chamber music on the first half, and the music of the students at PLU on the second half. And I always remembered that experience when I was teaching. When we had a guest composer, I always tried to do concerts that did that same thing, mixed the music of the guest with the music of the students, so everybody got to know one another. So as a result, I had a piece on the program, and as a result of the interaction during the week, there was a reception at the end of the week, and he at the end of the reception, he walked up to me and he said, you know, if you were to come to Poland, this is in 1974, Iron Curtain times, if you were to come to Poland and teach my children English, I would give you composition lessons and you could study at the conservatory in Krakow. And I thought he had too much wine, you know. I wasn't really convinced that this was real until 2 months later, he and his wife wrote to me it was a telex or fax. It was some sort of technology that doesn't exist anymore. And they said, we're expecting you at the end of August. Please come. Well, that would have been my senior year in college. I had plans, right? But I made the leap. I don't know how I had the courage to do it. I mean, I had been to Canada, I think once, Mexico maybe once with my folks. That was the extent of my international travel. And it was really a distant place, in those days. And in fact, my mother got my first letter once I got over there. My mother and father got my first letter, I think 6 weeks after I arrived.
Wow.
And I had been able to send them a telegram, that I arrived. But it was a dark and difficult time. And I didn't suffer at all because I was living with the Pendereckis in their home, nice home, and they took care of me. All of my needs were taken care of. But I watched the rest of the population there suffer enormously, standing in lines for food. And I saw maybe some bananas that winter, but that was the only fruit besides apples. There were lots of, it was an austere time, and it was not so long after the Vietnam War. There was a lot of negative propaganda from the Soviet Union, and towards Americans. It was eye-popping. I mean, it was quite an experience. So that was 1974-75. I went back to PLU. Finished up in a semester. I got a semester of credit for my time in Poland. And then what next? Well, I applied to go to Yale because Penderecki was going to be going to Yale. I'm sure it didn't hurt that I knew him. I acknowledged that, everybody needs a little help getting into these schools sometimes, and he, I'm sure, was helpful. And I was sort of felt a little strange about that, that maybe he. But turns out 1 year later, I won a BMI award while I was at Yale. And that was so affirming. It was so incredibly affirming because that was an anonymously submitted composition. And it did a whole lot to sort of bolster my confidence, that this was. So some of those early experiences can be very helpful to have a supportive teacher, maybe to make an impression somewhere else along the way, if it's a nice performance that somebody gives you, or maybe a competition, those things are very, very helpful. And now I've noticed over the last maybe 10 years, there have been many more opportunities for composers to enter competitions than there once were. And it's not so much the competition winning it, but it often provides opportunities for performance, which is really terrific. So I was at Yale for 3 years, lived with Pendereckis 2 of those years. And then what? Okay, what's next? More school, probably. I thought.
Let me stop you for a second. So this opportunity that you had was extraordinary, and you recognize that obviously now. Yeah. So what would you say to somebody who's on the cusp of a life that they had envisioned for themselves when an opportunity walks in front of them? I think particularly now, where kind of all bets are off, you know what I mean? I mean, what gave you the courage? What enabled you to step out of your comfort zone?
Yeah, it's a good question. The one thing that comes to mind almost immediately is that while I was in high school, I took 3 years of French. And that teacher, Mr. Smith, he took me out of Eatonville. He said, there's another world out there. And he would show us slides of his experiences in Paris and talk about a world. It seems in this age of the internet, I don't think young people may even understand what it's like to be living in a little town where you really don't have access to the world. But that was maybe part of it. Part of it might have been, I was maybe trying to separate from my parents, kind of. to separate from my world. I hadn't really, because I went to PLU, which was only 30 miles away from where I grew up. And maybe that was I was really ready to step outside because I hadn't, and I was already 21 years old.
Right.
So and also the persuasive, the persuasive letter from both Krzysztof and his wife Elżbieta. And they had these two children. They were planning to come to New Haven with them, and they needed them to have some ability to deal with the English language, and it seemed like kind of a nice trade. So I don't know. It might have been crazy. I was wheeling. I was kind of a risk taker. I have to say I've been through at least 6 of my 7 lives. And I mountain climbed and hung from ropes off of peaks, and in Washington you have all those opportunities, and I really did some crazy things in my life. Raced cars, but safely. It wasn't a really dangerous kind of racing.
Right. That's something you continued into adulthood, if memory serves. The car racing. Right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you there.
I said the car racing is something you continued to do for a time, right? Into adulthood.
Well, I don't car race now.
No, I know.
Oh.
But I remember something from when we did the book about BMWs and pylons.
Yeah. I had such fun doing all that. I mean, and I have a really special, my relationship with cars goes back to my dad, who was a service manager at a Chevrolet dealership for all his working life. And so cars were part of our family. And when we did vacations, we drove. We took cars places. We did fly places. We saw the countryside. The entire western part of that country was covered 2 or 3 times over. Those beautiful, wonderful western landscapes just can't be beat. And I've always loved the driving experience it's like a movie on your windshield. One of my big pleasures in life has been driving.
Well, I think that sneaks into your music big time, personally. I think it's very motoric.
Yeah.
More so than most. Yeah, so.
Yeah, there's a kind of motor there almost all the time, isn't there?
Right. So what did you pick up from him, particularly while you were nannying and you're in this critical year, senior year of college kind of thing?
Yeah.
Do you feel impact compositionally from that time?
Well, in those early days, I was trying to find my voice, and I did experiment with numbers of musical languages, or including whatever one I thought he was using, and others. And it took me several years after I studied with Penderecki to sort of find maybe my own voice, which came in large measure from my jazz experience, actually. And but so I don't think I took from him too much in the way of a musical voice, actually. Some. The one thing I did take from him, actually, that I can really point to is the idea of bringing older musics into a newer place. For example, in the St. Luke Passion, which I spoke about earlier, there's clear references to Gregorian chant with real clear tonal centers. There's the Requiem of Penderecki many years later, where there's a beautiful a cappella movement that uses a very tonal tune that's just absolutely gorgeous in the mix, in the middle of all of this chromatic kind of texture. And that idea of mixing tonal and atonal, or diatonic and chromatic and traditional and new, I think I did get that from him.
Yeah, and most recently, in terms of wind ensemble pieces, like the Mozart thing, that would be a classic example.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's crept into many of my pieces, if not almost all. I have a piece from it's a string piece called I call it the Adagio for strings. It's just Adagio, I guess, not for strings, but it is for strings, and it was that I used that tune from Krzysztof's Polish Requiem in there. That's sort of the basic tonal material of the piece. And it starts out very chromatically and works its way to this diatonic tonal place, and then goes back to a kind of questioning moment of chromaticism. And it's totally, that was influenced by him more than maybe any piece I'd written.
Right. And so that's what's interesting, I think, about composers of our generation. Like, so then you went to Yale and you did the whole Yale thing.
Yeah.
Which was probably more academic and tone row, and I'm guessing here, but I think I'm right. And yet, you know, coming out the other end, you have this language that is not really associated with that. So I think for students, especially people thinking about composition, they think, why go through that? And what would you get from that through that study and looking at a completely different thing that, you know, so in other words, why not just go write music? Why study music that necessarily isn't something you're going to sort of regurgitate or even be remotely influenced by in a certain way?
Right. Well, it seems like in order to really focus on, find your focus, I think, you know, you need to have multiple experiences. That it would be more difficult. I think you could find your focus eventually. I just think it's a little more efficient to study what's been done before, to try to figure out how that person did what that person did, and then apply some of those techniques or reject them. But I can't imagine composing in a complete void without some anchors, you know, some points of reference. We can't, it's just more efficient. You know, maybe we could get to that same place eventually, but you might also miss some really wonderful music.
Right.
You know, just put your head in the sand and shut out the rest. Sometimes composers will say, well, I don't want to listen to anybody else because I want to find my own way. Right. I get that. I think at some point you have to sort of do that, but you want that periphery there, that sort of security blanket around you of experiences you've had with other music, so you can push against it or embrace it, one of the two, you know, and it helps you find a focus, I think. I think I rely on my previous experience of other people's music quite a bit. In fact, I think a lot of my inspiration comes from things I've heard that other people have done. More though, you know, people ask about where's your inspiration come from? It's not so much about what I see or what I feel emotionally. It's more from what I've heard, for me. Right. And so that's why, one of the reasons why I do, when I'm about to begin a piece, I often do quite a bit of listening within the medium I'm about to write in. I'll do that for a while, and then it'll get sort of old, and I say, okay, I'm ready to do my own thing, and I put it away. But I
love what you're saying.
The puzzle process. There's this puzzle process that I like. Making music is sort of like a puzzle, and you know, you have this piece of music that you've heard that you really like, and there's something really intriguing, and it grabs you. Okay, I want to figure out what makes it tick. Yeah. How are those pieces of that puzzle fitting together? That's fun. I enjoy that.
Yeah, I love the proximity that you're talking about. You're talking about getting next to music and figuring out what it is, and then just through sort of environmental awareness, it may or may not influence you. But right. I love the fact that you said you can push against it, and just that friction alone would generate something. True enough?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, especially about your music, because it's not. Well, let's get into your music. I want to talk about that a little bit. When I first got your scores, I'll never forget kind of studying, getting ready, and then getting up and starting into it. The number of times I would laugh. It made me laugh, and it made me laugh because it's intentional, super funny, super tongue-in-cheek, and unexpected humor. So, where's that come from? It's awesome. But where's that come from? It's awesome.
I don't know, but here's one place it could come from. When I grew up in the 60s and 70s, musically speaking, into the 80s, and during that time, it was sort of not okay to embrace humor.
Right.
Everything was about angst and gritty and serious kinds of ways of being with music. And I did push against that. And part of that pushing against resulted perhaps in this idea of humor in music. And I gave myself permission to feel funny musically, and it comes out in whatever way it comes out. I think it's a lot about displaced. It's about rhythm. You know, you set up a repetition of some kind, and then you throw a monkey wrench in it, and it makes you laugh because it's like the punchline of a joke. It's an unexpected line at the end. Well, I didn't expect that. Well, it's funny. So it's so I do it with rhythm and with pitch too, and silences, you know, that you could fall in. But I think partly it was that I wanted to, just like I talked about the oppositions of tonal and atonal, or chromatic and diatonic, I like the idea of bringing oppositions together into the same place. Humor and seriousness kind of coexisting. That makes each one somehow more meaningful to me. If the piece is always about anger and dissonance and chromaticism, it's somehow less impactful to me than if there are moments that are lighter. Dark and light together perhaps make more.
Yeah, I think your music has some of the most lighthearted dissonance I've ever heard. It's true.
Yeah.
And it's so funny how we sort of stereotype, well, if it's dissonance, it's got to be angst. But you've done a remarkable job that way. And you know, just for the room, I think the way she does it, it's like a good comedian. It's all it's all timing. And
Yeah.
she has wonderful setups where she sort of lulls you to sleep, and then all at once there's this amazing surprise, like she said, often achieved by silence. It just makes you laugh. Or if you're a player that's not counting carefully, you feel stupid.
For traps to fall in, I'm sorry. Yeah, they're really.
Yeah, there's a lot of traps. There are definitely traps. Everybody on your toes. So you did the Yale thing, and then you went to University of Iowa.
I did. And you want to, okay, why Iowa? Well, you know, I was here I am at the end of my time at Yale, and I have a master's degree. And jobs are hard to find in the academic world. And I thought, well, that's probably what I want. You know, I always thought that's probably where I was headed. I never had whatever it takes. Maybe it's courage, maybe it's something else. To say, I'm going to go to New York City, or I'm going to go to LA, or I'm going to go someplace and be a composer, a freelance composer. I write music for orchestra, write music for film, write music for whatever it is. And I thought, you know, I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can make enough music to do that, make it quickly enough to do that. I might get tired of making music if I have to write music all the time to live. All those things. And my teacher at the time, Bruce McCombie, said, well, why don't you go study with my teacher? In Richard Hervig was his name, at the University of Iowa. And he said, and also, you know, apply to some other large Midwestern schools. You've had the Yale experience, you've been on the West Coast, the East Coast, now go someplace in the middle and see what happens. So I applied to Michigan and Illinois and Indiana and Iowa. And I was actually admitted to all four. But you know why I went to Iowa? Two things. Bruce McCombie, he said, you're gonna love Richard Hervig, and I did. He was a great teacher. He knew the repertoire. He knew everything about every piece of music that ever existed. It was amazing. And so he really took me through a lot of the standard rep. He'd sit at the piano and play it. See, isn't this cool? And look at how that composer did that. And he knew a lot about music history. And the other reason was, maybe the more practical one, maybe the real reason was, they offered me a TA-ship right away. They said, you can come and teach counterpoint. I had counterpoint, 2 years of counterpoint in 1 year in Poland. You can imagine that's sort of European. And you can teach for us right away, whereas the other schools said, well, you can come as a student, but it's going to be a year or so before we can give you a TA-ship. And I sort of needed the money. So I ended up at Iowa, and it was a great experience. In those days, they had a new music ensemble that was funded by, I think, the Rockefeller or Ford Foundation. I'm not sure now which, but we heard a lot of new music there, and it was at Hancher Auditorium, which was flooded and torn down, I think, a few years ago. Actually, it's not funny. Sorry. But the Joffrey Ballet would come through, the Chicago Symphony. It was a tour destination for many arts organizations. So I had a good time there. And at the end of that 4 years, whatever it was, 1981, I was as scared as I've ever been in my life. Okay, now what? I'm out of school. There's no more school. Am I really going to get a job? And I've empathized during my entire teaching career with students who really feel that fear, especially at the end of their student days. What's next? And it's a rough time because you just really don't know. And I applied for many jobs, and I was the first interview. I think I had an interview in Hanover at Dartmouth. I had an interview at Harvard.
Wow.
I don't think they were sort of real interviews, I have to say, but I think that was a gender thing in those. I think it kind of was actually, but it's okay. I shouldn't have been there anyway. I wouldn't have been the right. I wasn't a good match for those places, and I wasn't a good match for the next place, which was Montgomery, Alabama. So I went down for an interview in Montgomery, Alabama, and they wanted me to teach music history, music appreciation, band composition, theory, everything. And I wasn't prepared to do that. And I thought, wow, that's the only real offer I have. I guess I'm going to have to take it. So I took it. And I swear it was a week later, I get a call from David Robbins at PLU, and he said, we'd like you to come teach for us. We have an opening. And I said, well, I can't. I've just accepted a job at the University of Alabama, Montgomery. I said, we could ask him to be released from it. I said, oh, really? Okay. So I said, and this was a job at PLU was much more appropriate for my skills. And going back home, my parents were just a few miles away. So I called up the chair of the department and I said, here's the situation. I'm not asking to be released from a position, but if you feel like we could work something out, let's see. And he said, well, I understand completely. And he said, if you pay back the cost of the interview, you have my blessing.
Oh, wow.
Wasn't that something? Wasn't that
cool.
Incredible?
Right.
And so I went to PLU for 3 years before I went to University of North Texas.
Right.
But when it's a lesson in, you're up against the wall and you feel like you don't want to disappoint somebody. But Dave said, well, why don't you just ask and see, explain the situation. And I'm pretty sure they got a better person than I would have been for that job. Somebody with lots of eclectic experiences. They probably ended up with somebody much better. So it probably worked out for everybody.
Yeah, I think the great lesson there obviously is you can always ask, what's the worst that can happen? They say no.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So from PLU, you went to Denton.
Yeah.
And how did that come about?
Well, the job at PLU was a kind of temporary job. Can't remember now exactly why, but I ended up at the end of that 3 years, I had to apply for jobs again, and it turns out they found a way to keep me. Would have found a way to keep me even longer, but I had already started the application process, and North Texas asked me to come down for an interview, and it felt really good. And it involved teaching composition only and related courses, orchestration, a new music class once in a while. And it was very focused and more money and a bigger school with more performance opportunities for me, not far from a big city, Dallas. It all seemed like a good idea. And I didn't have a guarantee that I could go back to, that I could continue at PLU until I'd already done the interview at North Texas. And I decided, well, it just felt right. It felt like a good thing to do. And it turned out to be a very good place to be. I liked the idea. It was a huge school, 1,500 music students still, I think. And it was, I could sort of lose myself in the in the mix of things, and there were so many wonderful performance opportunities, not only from student ensembles, which were really very good, but also the faculty. So it offered me some things, and I think I felt like I could bring a more focused experience to the teaching. I always felt a little bit out of my element. Even at PLU, I had to teach a world music class and a few things that I didn't know anything about. And the students probably they suffered through it with me. But at North Texas, it felt better, right, to go to that kind of a teaching situation. And then I got to meet wonderful people like Eugene Corpron, who recorded everything I think I wrote for Winds, and it was a good time.
I will always I will always remember when they hosted the National CBDNA and opened a concert with Timepiece.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a jaw-dropping performance. Jaw-dropping. It was.
Thank you, yeah.
So how do you, you're an academic faculty at PLU, how do you wind up being you in terms of all these major symphony orchestras in this country and abroad playing your music? How did that happen? I mean, because you have all the biggies on your resume, all of them.
Yeah. So I was, let's see, it was 1990 or so when I wrote Circuits. I was at Denton at the University of North Texas, and a friend of mine said, why don't you write a piece for our faculty chamber orchestra? And my husband says he put up $1,000 for the commission, and that sounded like a really great deal to me at the time, and performance opportunity. I said, okay, I'll do. Let's see what I can do. And so the piece was premiered by a small orchestra in a church in Denton, Texas. And I remember Martin Mailman, whom I'm sure you knew, esteemed composer, wrote a lot of wind music. He said to me, you need to transcribe that piece for band right away.
Smart boy.
He was the one who started the transcription process. So this piece was published by my first publisher, my one and only publisher. I do my own right now, but based in St. Louis. And their composer, the St. Louis Symphony had a composer in residence by the name Claude Baker. And Claude Baker was also published by MMB Music. And MMB gave Claude Baker Circuits, and Claude Baker gave Circuits to Leonard Slatkin, who was the music director of the St. Louis Symphony.
And is in the next room, I should say.
And he's in the next room. So that began my musical love affair with my current husband. So he programmed the piece on a subscription concert, and I went for the performances, and I thought, okay, I've died and gone to heaven. I don't have to live anymore. I don't have to write any more music. It was such a wonderful experience. And then he played it a lot after that with lots of different orchestras. And he commissioned in 2000, I got a call from him to he wanted me to write a piece for the National Symphony Orchestra, a symphony. And so I thought, wow, I didn't think I'd ever write a symphony, but okay. In 2002, it was played at Carnegie Hall, and Kennedy Center was just quite something. And I digress, but this is kind of a fun story, I think. So in the fall of, no, sometime in the fall, I think, of 2008, I got wind of the fact that he would be conducting in Dallas Symphony, and I hadn't heard from him in a while after the symphony performance. Where's Leonard? I haven't heard from him in so long. And then I saw he was going to be performing in Dallas, so I wrote to him. I said, would you be willing to come to North Texas and do something at school? And I credit Eugene Corporon, my friend, band director there, for having sort of made all this happen, because he said, well, I'll provide an ensemble and we'll have a gathering, and he can. So Leonard conducted some William Schumann and something else, I guess. And so I took him up to North Texas. The next day we had our first date. So Leonard and I had known each other since 1986, whenever it was, 1988, through music. We had many encounters in, doing pre-concert lectures for that kind of thing over the years, the commission for the symphony. And, so it was an easy friendship to transition into something else.
So you have a husband and a champion. That's kind of cool.
Well, it was, yes. And there were some others that were very important too in terms of the orchestra world. Andy Litton in Dallas commissioned a couple of pieces. Timepiece was one of his commissions, another piece called Einstein's Dream for electronic instruments recorded on CD and orchestra. Hans Graf conducted a trombone concerto with the Houston Symphony. But I think Leonard is in large measure responsible for whatever orchestral experience or career I've had, because that was the beginning of it. He started it all.
Right.
And he was a champion of so many, and continues to be a champion of so many composers.
Yes.
And what would we do without you guys that champion our work and make it come to life, and all of the unbelievable students and other people who have thrown their hearts and souls into our music. I'm so humbled by all of that, that it takes to bring a piece to life. It's one thing for composer to put the notes on the page, but you have to somebody who wants it, somebody who's agreeing to play it, somebody who rehearses it, somebody who practices and gets ready to rehearse. I mean, and the people who build the buildings it's a huge thing to have a piece come to life. It's about so much more than just putting notes on the page, but it's not just the composer's piece, it's everybody's piece.
Right. So I just have one or two more questions, but I just want to say to the students, I want to honor our time commitment with Cindy, because dinner is being prepared by her chef.
It's okay.
But I don't, you probably won't remember this. You were in town for something, and we had dinner down in Sandpoint Way by the university.
Yes, I do remember that.
We were talking about stuff I'll never forget. We were talking about the advantages to writing for wind ensemble compared to the orchestra.
Uh-huh.
And because of your pieces, I remember we were talking about the fact that your pieces are so driven and so more motoric and this and that. And you were talking about the fact that wind ensembles have the ability to sort of kick it when it comes to that. I'll always remember that. It was cool. It raised our class from second class citizen for a moment.
Oh. Well, it's true. It's true. And I did play the saxophone, so right. There's a certain place in my heart for the wind instruments. And actually, if I could have picked an instrument to play, it definitely would have been the drums, the percussion. But I don't think my parents thought it was cool for little girls to hit things, so they gave me the saxophone to play. But there's that, and there's just this sort of longer term commitment to the music. I mean, and lots more rehearsal time, and so many young people involved, and it's always a good experience to be around a band.
I think so. So just the last question I have, how would you say, because I have my own notions on this and I'm probably wrong, and I'm just curious, how would you say your music has changed over time?
Oh, over how
Since
much
like, since like, let's talk like 1990, that was kind of a little
time?
bit of a coming out for you, I think, in your career.
Well, I would sort of start with maybe the 60s and 70s, because that's when I sort of started noticing music as a profession, and I remember many of my teachers or guest artists that would come through. Uh, they were pretty demanding of a certain approach to making music. I'm not going to name names. That would not be nice. But it kind of seems like what's happened in the last 30 years or so is a kind of loosening of the way we are with music, that there's not one way to do it. If you think about what happened after Schoenberg and after, you shall heights in this style of Schoenberg, or I break your hand, it's sort of Germanic, that's sort of a generalization, but a requirement in a way that if you want to consider yourself to be a serious composer, you're going to rebel, and this is the way you're going to rebel. Not that tonal stuff. We're going to destroy all that and do it differently. And it just didn't work for me. I remember rebelling against that and saying to myself, and it took a while though. It took me into my later graduate years to sort of get that I wasn't cut out to write high modernism like so many were interested in. Still, there's a lot of it going on still.
Yeah.
In Europe more than here, perhaps.
Right.
But in America, I think we broke away from that. It was so refreshing to be able to incorporate the vernacular music, to say that the vernacular music, jazz and pop music and electronica or whatever it might be, folk music, indigenous people's music, any music is okay in terms of its usefulness as compositional material, and let's embrace it all and see what we can do and have some fun.
Right.
I think that's how music has changed. It's more fun now.
Right.
It makes this eclecticism I'm kind of talking about it means that maybe there are more options now, and that can be harder for artists to try to sort of sort through. And you have to, okay, what of all that am I going to work with or embrace? Because in those days, in those sort of postmodern days, it was prescribed. It was pretty clear. You're going to manipulate pitch in this way, and these are, if you don't repeat any tones until you've heard all 11 of the rest of them. No, it's real. I mean, I'm simplifying, but there was that sort of attitude that, if it's not thorny, it's not okay, it's not valid.
Right.
I think that's changed a lot. They were able, but I use that all the time. I mean, there are 12-tone passages in almost every piece I've written. Right. So I'm not saying it's something that's not useful. It really is, but along with the other. As a way of that, the expressive possibilities are huge if you embrace everything, and then at the end of the day, I don't like saying that. At the end, you do have to boil it down. That's one of the things I used to always say to my students: make the most of the least. Mm-hmm. So you have to. I prefer to use minimal materials in my music, actually, in any single piece in the end, but the option to use anything is still there. That's the thing. The options are, and boiling it down, making it very clear, and making the most out of the least, I think, is one path toward satisfying composition, satisfying structure, satisfying form. Is If there's too much of one thing, that doesn't work. If there's too much of everything, that doesn't work, right? So making the most of the least gives you that kind of balance, I think. Whatever that is, whatever that means. But that's I think one of the most important things we composers have to figure out is, when is it too much and when is it not enough? You know, do I need to use that idea a little bit more to give the work some continuity? Do I need to make a change? When do I make a change to break things up and create some contrast? That's really hard, but that's making the most out of the least. That sort of is my compositional mantra.
Well, I think that nobody does it better than you. And the intellectual rigor, the technical proficiency you need, the humor, and like you said, making the most of the least within a structure everybody gets. It's beautiful stuff. It's beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
Doing it. So we want to give the students a chance. They have been siphoning questions, hopefully to Dan Fisher, who's one of my teaching assistants, and Dan's going to kind of moderate. What do you have, Dan?
So we have two questions so far, and one of the questions was right before this call. We were all sent a recording of circuits and to listen to, and one of the students was asking specifically, what was your process in composing circuits, and how did you go from kind of start to finish?
Well, it was a long time ago, so I'll try my best. But the process was probably not unlike the process I've used for many pieces, and generally I have some kind of overarching idea about the piece. In the case of circuits, it had to be short, because they said this will be the first piece on the program, and we needed to be an overture sort of piece, so we needed to be short. So I thought, okay, I'm going to put as much in that 5 minutes as I possibly can. I don't have much time, I better pack it in. So that means it's going to be an up-tempo piece, and full of energy, and 5 minutes long. That's sort of, and for orchestra. So those basic parameters are sort of in mind, the larger stuff. And because it was 5 minutes, I thought, well, probably isn't going to be in movements. I'll just make it one movement, maybe with a couple of sections. Turns out that I think there are about 3 big sections. And that's probably where I start with most pieces, basic, big picture ideas. And then I try to create small things, motivic units of 2 or 3 or 10 notes maybe, or rhythmic ideas. And I work on these little germ seeds. It's a little bit like you're building a house, let's say, and you already know it's going to be a 3-bedroom house with a porch and a recreation room or something. So that, and then you have to say, well, what am I going to build my house with? I have to have nails and wood and bricks and mortar and all that kind of stuff. I have to assemble those materials and put them in piles, so they're ready to go when I want to build my house. And that's sort of how I make a piece. Because when I get into the business of stringing events together, I want to have access to materials I've already made, in part anyway, that can be then reworked and expanded. But I want to be able to, in the process of composing from left to right, I want to have those little things sort of available to me. So, ba-de-da, ba-de-da, ba-de-da. That's in circuits, and that was probably one of the first ideas I came up with. It's a bum-ba-da-dum, bum-ba-da-dum, ba-de-da, ba-ba-dum. So variations on it, right? And that's sort of how I make music. Little things become larger things through development and manipulation of rhythm and pitch. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you. The other one is, do you listen to music without trying to figure it out? For instance, does the motivation to take music a part happen even when you're maybe listening to music to relax or not looking for inspiration?
You know, I almost never listen to music to relax. I almost never listen to music except in a concert or to study it, truth be known. I almost never listen to it for pleasure on CD recording. I prefer silence, except when I'm in the concert hall, except when I'm working with young musicians, except when I'm composing, except, so work, it's almost as if music is work for me, and it's pleasurable work, but when I'm in the car, I listen to the engine. I don't turn the radio on. I wonder if other people are like that. I don't know. As a musician, I really am very selective about what I listen to, when I listen to it, if I listen to it. I love going to concerts. I love experiencing new music for the first time. I love hearing old friends. I've been to thousands of concerts in the last 10 years, mostly of orchestral music, having traveled with my husband for months on end doing concerts all over the world. And I think I've heard pictures at an exhibition 20 times and all the Beethoven symphonies multiple times. And it's a wonderful experience to revisit in the concert hall, focused, live orchestra, but almost never. What was your question?
No, that's great. That's great. It was from one of our other students, just trying to understand how, like, if you do listen to music, are you able to separate from maybe listening for pleasure or versus listening for like trying to really unravel and try to understand the work?
It's probably the case that one of the reasons maybe I don't listen sort of in a relaxed setting is because I can't relax and listen to music. I don't know. I'm always, so I don't know. There are many reasons why I don't listen recreationally to music, but that could be one of them, where I want to get inside the piece and then I sort of lose the recreational aspect of it by doing, I don't know. But partly it's because I love silence. I like to imagine music almost more than I like listening to it, in some sense of, you know, that's not entirely true, but it can be just as fulfilling to imagine a sound as to actually hear it. So, to imagine a sound, you probably mostly need silence. It's hard to do it when there's, and when I'm not composing as much now at all, but when I was really, because I'm too, well, now I probably have more time, but things have changed in the last few months, haven't they? But when I was in my full composing mode, especially in the summer between terms, I would go into it. I would do anything possible to create a silent working space. I was at one point I was living in an apartment. I got plexiglass and completely lined all the windows in my studio, so I wouldn't hear cars honking, and I just didn't want any sound around me. You know?
Sure. Yeah.
That makes sense to me, actually, Cindy, because I think that your music, silence is such an important virtue. It's actually a virtue of your music, and it's a virtue you've cultivated. That's beautiful.
It's funny, isn't it? You know, if music is about sound, but it really is about sound and what happens between the sounds.
That's right.
Which is silence, sometimes not very long one, but it's got to be framed by the sound has to be framed by something, and I think that something is silence.
Absolutely. Well, I want to be honest and respectful of our time together, and we're past the hour mark, and I just can't thank you enough for this. We just deeply appreciate it. So well, tradition, we all turn our microphones on and we clap for our guests. And
but before you do that, let me just say I've just had a blast, and I wish you all the best. And I hope these composition projects you'll send me. I saw a link to a couple of them, but at the end of all this, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, check them out. They're interesting. It's what the students are doing is really quite something. We're excited.
And I think it's very cool that they're composing. I think of course I would say this, one of the best ways to learn music is to try to write it.
Right, exactly. That's kind of what the premise was. Well, all right, you guys turn on your microphones and let's applaud Professor McTee, please. Thank you. Thank you. So, Cindy, if you to go, everybody else stay on the call for a bit, and Cindy to leave. You just hit leave down in the bottom right corner. Then you'll get another prompt.
Okay. Oh, I hate leaving. Okay.
Bye-bye.
I don't see the leave part. I don't think I can leave. Oh, there we go. All right. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim. This has been great. Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Bye-bye.